Laurie McKnight is going to introduce our first speaker today. And Laurie, without further ado, let me just turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And good morning to everyone. And we're going to have a wonderful morning. We have, I've been called upon to introduce and welcome Christine Jerrett. And she's provided me with some background information. Reverend Dr. Christine Jerrett has a strong commitment to training leaders for congregations for the new context in which we find ourselves. She's been an ordained minister of the United Church since 1982, retiring in June of this year. Yay, congratulations, Christine. She has worked with a variety of congregations, most of them facing a time of transition and change. In 2010, she received her DMin from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, with a focus on culture and congregational change. She worked as a consultant with EDGE, which is a network for ministry development, from 2014 to 2016, and was EDGE's animator for new ministry development, rural and small town churches, and coordinator for ministry renewal until December of last year. In 2014 to 2015, she received the McGeechee Senior Scholarship from the United Church of Canada Foundation with the focus on lay leadership in the United Church. She's the director of Canadian Shield's online training course for licensed lay worship leaders, which is hosted also by United in Learning. And she has also is a blogger. She lives in Sarnia, which sounds like maybe her hometown. Is that right, Christine?
Yes. Yeah.
And with her husband, Keith, who also retired in June. Now, she's going to, in a moment, she's provided me with what her lecture would be this morning, which I'll share. I've had personal contact with Christine a couple of years ago when she was, I guess, working as an animator. I mean, I was serving a downtown Ottawa sort of inner city type church, but she was working for EDGE, and we'd received money, and it was a very challenging time for our congregation and for me as the leader. And Christine's presence and her voice at the other end, and just listening, and the wisdom she offered, she really, it was a moment of being healed and saved at the same time. So she comes with many, many gifts. So I'd like to thank Christine personally for that phone call and her wonderful support. So we're looking forward to the first lecture, When the Spirit Says Move. An overview is the new landscape in which congregations are participating in God's mission, and the new ways that congregations are hosting and living this story. So, welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to reflect with you about pathways to regeneration. And thank you to all of you for being here and being conversation partners. I wonder what sort of tale we have fallen into. That's the question that Samwise Gamgee asks Frodo Baggins in the story The Lord of the Rings. Have you read The Lord of the Rings? Have you watched the movie? The Lord of the Rings is a large story. It is a grand epic. Good, thanks, Monica. Good to know that there's some feedback there. That's great. It's a large story and a grand epic tale. It tells the story of a group of people who find themselves given a task, a great task. The group is made up of diverse characters, some of whom would normally be enemies or rivals of each other, but they come together pulled by a call that is greater than the things that divide them. In order to accomplish the task, they embark on a long journey. The journey is filled with threats and dangers and challenges that require great courage and great perseverance. At many points along the way, they do not know if they are going to make it. Indeed, some do not. Included in this group, then, this community, this fellowship, as it is called, are 4 hobbits. Hobbits are a humble folk. They live in a quiet, out-of-the-way place called the Shire. And hobbits are not generally the adventurous type. However, they do love to tell stories, especially long, involved stories about the adventures of others. There are 4 hobbits in the group, and near the end of their journey, 2 of them, Frodo and Sam, have been separated from the rest of the company. They've continued on even though they are tired and hungry and thirsty. They are pretty certain that they will die before they have completed their task. The dangers they face are still large and threatening. They're too large and too threatening for their own resources. At one point, then, they stop to regain some strength, to rest and regain some strength. And Sam begins to think about the stories they used to tell each other in the Shire. He notes that in the tales that really mattered, the ones that stay in the mind, the people in the story originally don't go out looking for adventures because their life was a bit dull. Rather, he observes, folks seem to have been just landed in them usually. Their paths were laid that way. A little later, Sam says to Frodo, I wonder what sort of tale we have fallen into. He hopes that it is a good one. I wonder what sort of story you and I have fallen into. Everybody lives by some story, by some script. You may not be aware of it as you go about your day-by-day lives, but whatever the script is, it is shaping the communities in which you live. There's also a script that is shaping your congregation. The script tells you what kind of story you are in. It tells you what really matters, what things really matter. It frames what you are doing. It tells you what is possible and where people will find life and hope, safety, security, happiness. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says that the dominant script that shapes our communities in the West, in the modern world, is one of therapeutic, technological, militaristic consumerism. Therapeutic, technological, militaristic consumerism. He says our culture is therapeutic in that it assumes that there is a product or treatment for every ache and pain and discomfort and trouble so that our lives may be lived without inconvenience. He says our culture is technological in that we trust that human ingenuity will be able to fix every problem. Consumerism believes that every need can and should be satisfied regardless of its cost to the neighbor. Or as Andy Crouch says, consumerism says we are most human when we are purchasing something that someone else has made. It is militaristic because people assume that all this privilege can and should be defended militarily. And, says Brueggemann, it is now evident that that script has failed. It cannot keep its promises. It cannot deliver either security or happiness, despite the redoubled efforts of the powers and systems that live by that script. In a somewhat similar fashion, Alan Roxburgh describes our dominant script as technocratic rationalism. He says we are living out what he calls modernity's wager, the conviction that life can be lived well without any practical reference to God. We are in control. We have within ourselves the knowledge, the skills, and the capacity to create a good life. With the right tactics, with the right strategies, we can manage our way out of the problems that confront us. And he says we are living in a time when that script is unraveling. The pandemic has made openly evident what has been fermenting beneath the surface for a while now. The structures we have had in place to order society have been crumbling for some time. They no longer work. They no longer help us navigate our lives. Do you remember when the late Phyllis Tickle said that every 500 years there's a major cultural shift, that something like a garage sale? She says that's the story we're in, a massive garage sale where we're getting rid of some junk that we've accumulated over the centuries, and we are making room for something new to emerge. Do you find any of those descriptions helpful in outlining the script that shapes life in your community? Do you recognize them in the way your community functions, in the way people relate to one another? Or perhaps your community is shaped by a different script. I want to invite us to put into the chat box your reflections on what is the story or the script that is shaping the community where you live these days. What kind of big story are you and your neighbors living in? And we'll just give you a few minutes to fill in something and add it to the chat box and talk about those scripts that are shaping our lives these days. It may be the one of the ones that I described earlier, or you may discern that there's some other script shaping your life, or the life of in your community.
So Greg says, God loves, God saves, God calls us to participate in God's work. And Eric says, trying to cooperate and collaborate while each or all of us pursue our own individual targets. It's confusing.
Mm-hmm. And just a note of clarification, what the question I'm asking is not about our church communities, but about the community, the neighborhood, the culture in which you are living.
Laurie says, how do we decolonize our attitudes in our church? And Orville adds, cushioning ourselves from the harsh realities of the rest of the world that we might continue our lives towards leisure and entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
I think the big script in my congregation for the last 18 months has been the pivot. That's a responding to crisis and trying to find new ways to continue to be church when some of the old ways simply are inaccessible to us now.
And just to pivot your question or your answer a little bit, Stephen, what is the script? Is that same script being played out in the community in which your church exists, in the neighborhood?
To some extent, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think that's some of what I've heard too.
Mm-hmm. I think it's changed everything around what we do and what we care about and what we notice and what we wear and where we go to work. But I mean, I think that's, Allison called it a blip yesterday. I think it's more than a blip, but it is also not a sort of generational script. It really is this particular 5-year era, I think.
Yeah.
Let me read some more here. Pamela says, oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up because there's a few here. We're living in an oppressive community that's against everything we stand for, says Monica. The culture is very much dog eat dog, Darwinian survival. Don't tell me what to do or where. Jean says,
that's Alberta, yeah.
Yeah. The community feels that if we can only get everyone vaccinated, things can get back to normal, says Jean.
Yeah.
Pamela says, I think the script for our young people says you'll never own a home. There's a sense of hopelessness. And Todd echoes that. Young people unable to afford to live in our community, a script of polarization of haves and have-nots. Reed says, who can be a Quebecer? How can we shift to a greener people? How can we listen and learn from indigenous neighbors? And Eric says, just a general sense of befuddlement as our society is left past strengths and about what comes next. Maggie picks up the haves and have-nots. She says, coming to acquaint ourselves with poverty. And Genji adds, coming to terms with colonial traditions, history, presenting an affirming Christian presence. Janet says, community around the church is quiet. We don't see many people outside. And adds, pandemic restrictions added to global warming and waning economic abundance, added to the international crises. Brad's reflecting on befuddlement. Good word, he says. Low-grade fear arising from uncertainty about what's ahead, trying to hang on to comfort that we've taken so long to create.
Yeah, I was at the chiropractor the other day, and the other person in the room said, was asked, how are you doing? He says, I just have this sense that of impending something is about to happen that isn't good. And the chiropractor said, yeah. He says, a lot of people are feeling that way. Or this impending crisis coming up. As we continue to read what people are putting in there, what is it? I'd like to invite us to reflect just for a few moments on what we notice about those stories, and just highlight if there's some recurring themes, some recurring mood that seems to be common for people.
Well, certainly, Ryan already mentioned a sense of living in a rainbow of all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
A common sense of community isolation, fear of the unknown, says Walter, a sense of discomfort. It's interesting, I was talking to somebody the other day who was talking about how many of the movies we watch these days are dark. Not a lot of optimism, sense of dystopia.
I think those are all signs and symptoms of what Brueggemann calls the script has failed, or Roxburgh says the script is unraveling. We live in a time of unraveling.
Sense of being overwhelmed, says Maggie.
From the unknown, constant
The constant and the content pivoting. We don't know what to trust in. Pessimism, says Monica, and the church in our society is dying.
Okay.
Major shift just over the horizon is coming toward us, says Eric, like the beginning of a war or earthquake or other significant change, unknown and unclear. Change is in the air, says Reed, and necessary, trying to stay hopeful.
Okay, well, those are good lead-ins to the next few things I want to talk with you about. Like any dominant script, modernism seeks to displace all other stories and imagination. It wants people to believe that this is just the way things are, and it discourages any alternative scripts. And yet, as Christians, that is exactly what we've been given in our tradition. As Christians, we've been entrusted with an alternative script. The story we are in is given to us in the stories of the Bible, the stories of God's relationship with the people of Israel and the followers of Jesus. And this script has been enacted in the history and the traditions of the church, although not always faithfully. That story is a great gift, but when we take it seriously, it does not make our lives easy. As we find our place in that story, we are given holy work by the God who is faithfully at work, confronting the powers of oppression and violence and death. This same God is also powerfully at work, creating new life and beauty and goodness. And both the work against the powers of death and the work for life puts us in difficult and challenging places. This overarching story is complex and diverse and multi-layered, and some of its stories come to the foreground more prominently at some times than at others. A particular community of faith will find some stories speak to it more helpfully and more compellingly than other stories at different times. Do you remember early on in the pandemic, people were not just dealing with the alarming spread of this largely unknown virus and our ability to manage its effects. There were devastating wildfires in the West and record-shattering storms in the East. The economy was staggering under supply chain issues and the shuttering of many businesses. The murder of George Floyd led to Black Lives Matter marches across the continent. We became aware of the persistent racism that continues to wound and dehumanize all of us. At one point, there was a Facebook meme in which a woman was looking out of her front door with this terrified look on her face. And she said, "I'm just checking to see which chapter of Revelation we're in today." It makes a difference what story you understand that you are in. That story shapes your comprehension of what's really going on, and you experience a situation differently if you know that you're only in the middle of the story, and if you know that how all that is happening will turn out in the end. Do you remember how in the midst of the struggle to overthrow apartheid in South Africa, Desmond Tutu would often remind people about the end of the story? He would say to them, "I've read the end of the book. We win." The story points you in the direction you need to be looking for hope, a hope that will pull you forward even when the path ahead is dark and you cannot see your way. The story will frame what you need to be doing in the midst of all that is happening, how to negotiate the current challenges before church and world faithfully. The story helps you hear the questions that God is asking of you, the questions to which you must give answer with your life. Here are some examples. In the United Church, it has seemed fairly common that congregations consider themselves living in the story of the prophet Micah. Micah lived in Judah before the fall of Israel to the Babylonians, and he rebuked the people for the corruption in government and their dishonesty in the market. And so if you feel that this is the part of the story that you're in, then your congregation's work is to what? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Another part of our story that has been prominent in the United Church talk in the past few years is the story of Israel in exile in Babylon. If you understand that the story your congregation is in is the story of exile, then the work you have been given to do is to help people weep as they remember Zion, to grieve the losses of the way it used to be. But your work is also to help them figure out how to sing the Lord's song in a strange land, to find a way forward in a land in which all the usual supports have disappeared. Your hope is in a God who is faithful, even in exile, and who is able to transform even exile into a livable world. Perhaps it seems rather that your congregation is living in the story of Ezekiel's vision of the valley of the dry bones. Then, if that's the case, then the work facing your congregation is to prophesy to the wind. Breathe life into these dry bones, you are to say. Your hope is that God's life-giving word can bring light, new life where none seemed possible before. Recently, I was working with a group of congregations, and we imagined what it would mean what it means for them to be living in the story of the slavery of the Hebrew people in Egypt. Specifically, we looked at that part of the story where Pharaoh requires the midwives to kill all the baby boys that are born to the Hebrew slaves. We asked, what does it mean to midwife the future in a dangerous time? What does it mean to resist the empire in ways that allow new life to come to birth? The work of the church in such a story becomes less that of chaplaincy, caring for and comforting the people. It becomes more a matter of figuring out how to instill courage in ordinary people. How do humble, modest folk become bold enough and imaginative enough and wily enough to outsmart the powers that are disrupting and destroying life? How do you train people to act with such hope and with such courage? University Hill United Church in Vancouver, BC has had a practice of the people checking in with each other by asking, what day are you in? Are you in Good Friday, when everything that you hoped in is ending? Or are you in Holy Saturday, that in-between time when the old is gone, but there's nothing to do but sit in silence and grief and despair, waiting to receive the new future our holy God may now give? Are you in Easter morning, experiencing God's resurrection power, but still confused, unsure of what to make of it all? So if I asked you to pick a story from the Bible that depicts the story that your congregation is in, which story would you choose? If I asked you to pick a story from the Bible that depicts the story your congregation is in, which story would you choose? And I want to invite you again to put your answers into the chat box, and we can talk about what those stories are saying to us. Babylonian exile, so how do you sing the Lord's song in a strange land?
Holy Saturday, says Maggie, in between time. And that says not necessarily a long-term story, but in this moment of the pandemic in Ontario, Moses looking at the promised land but unable to go there. Ryan, 1 Samuel 8, seeking worldly rulers instead of God.
Reluctant Moses, love that.
Reluctant Amos, it says Walter, yeah.
Yeah.
The Valley of Dry Bones, says Irene. Or Ezra, says Kenji, teaching and reminding people how to live in God's way while rebuilding a more modest and lesser temple.
Mm.
Jerrett says the potential implicit in the stance of Peter and the disciples in the book of Acts in relation to people asking, what does this mean? Can we discern the Lord's reign here? And Kim is really resonating with the story of Micah. Our congregation is called to do works of justice, acts of kindness, and walking humbly, resiliently, conscientiously with God, with each other, and with all of creation. And Todd says, bless Jesus, blessing the children, finding life in blessing each other within our walls and outside. Jamie adds, slowly making our way up to Jerusalem where the crucifixion will happen, where we know how the story will end.
Mm.
Slavery in Egypt, says Reed. Slavery to the past, who we were, how to move forward into the wilderness. Will it be productive? Will God be with us? And Lynn adds, Ruth, much loss, but being a companion in the journey.
Lovely. Can we take a few moments then to reflect on what we notice about those stories? Any themes we see, or any surprises? Anything that leads us to ask new questions? I hear that there's still a kernel of hope.
We feel somehow caught between shifting plates, says Eric. Uncertain, hopeful, a little hesitant, sometimes afraid, often lamenting the good old days in our hearts, and then looking forward and taking a deep breath. And Jeannie says, in a time of transition, looking for hope.
Thank you.
It's not the end of the story, says Maggie.
That's
That's a common thread through a lot of these comments, Christine.
Yes, yeah, that we're in an in-between time.
And Kenji says he's got questions about what questions to consider.
That's very helpful.
Kevin says we're in the chaos waiting for light to break. And a favorite hymn in my congregation these days is Precious Lord, Take My Hand. We
Yes.
haven't sung a lot of God Comfort Us hymns before the pandemic. There aren't a lot left in our hymn book, but that's become really important to my folks. We live in the here and now, says Kim, despite the challenges, but better days will come, is what Kim is trying to say.
I like Stephen, you're mentioning about the hymns that you're singing, and maybe that's a way to help us understand what story we're in, and the shape of that story is what hymns become important to us.
Our hymns have changed dramatically in the pandemic. It's interesting.
Yeah. About a year ago, I participated in a webinar with Leonard Sweet about contextual intelligence. He said, contextual intelligence is the capacity to know what context, what time you are in, and then to know what to do with that time. He tells the story of Israel in the time between the reign of Saul and the reign of David. Two scripts, two ways of ordering society are competing for dominance. And then the tribe of Issachar shows up, and they said, well, you can count on us to know the times and to know what to do with the times. That's the story we are in, says Sweet. We need people from the tribe of Issachar. They know their world in the light of the word, and they know a path forward into the future that God is calling them to enter. Sweet began the webinar by riffing off reformer John Calvin and reminding us who we are as the Church of Jesus Christ. He said, we are here by divine appointment. In the sovereignty and the providence of God, God has chosen you and me for such a time as this moment in time. This is not our choice. We don't get to choose our moment. The moment God has chosen for us is a COVID and post-COVID world. Someone has said that 2020 was one of the 10 worst years in human history. We feel totally unprepared for this moment, but we are here for a reason. As we navigate through what we hope is the tail end of the pandemic, it's evident that we live in a damaged and disrupted time. This is a confused and confusing and dangerous world. The supports and the structures that we have counted on to keep our lives safe and secure have been crumbling around us. The economy, the healthcare system, the educational system, the ways we live in creation, and our churches too, have been crumbling for some time before the pandemic. The pandemic simply shouted at us in a loud voice, what in many cases has been whispering beneath the surface for years. We live in an anxious time, and in our anxiety, many of us have become preoccupied with the survival of the church, of our own particular congregations. We've forgotten what we have, that we have not simply just landed in the midst of some random happenings. Many of our congregations have lost sight of the fact that we are here for a reason. We are here by divine appointment. The organizers of this year's conference have signaled in the title of the conference that the story we are living in is a story of regeneration. Our COVID and post-COVID world is a new beginning, a new Genesis. The story we are in is a Genesis story. The book of Genesis wasn't written to tell us how the earth got started. It was written to give hope and courage to a people who had lost hope for the future. It says, the kind of story we are in is one in which our God is active, making pathways to regeneration, making a new Genesis. The God who has claimed our lives is a living and active and creative God who takes the murky chaos, the confusion and confusing void which surrounds us, and speaks a new creation into being. It's not by accident that the gospel writers begin the story of Jesus as Genesis stories, regeneration stories. Moses begins with birth, the birth of a baby as the result of the work of the Holy Spirit in a young person's life. The Holy Spirit who shows up and makes things new. And then Matthew traces the generations of Jesus' ancestors back to Abraham and Sarah, the beginning of faith, a people of faith in Yahweh, signaling that with Jesus coming to earth, we are in the time of a new Genesis. Mark 1 says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Luke takes Jesus' family tree all the way back to Adam. John most clearly signals that he is telling a regeneration story. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Gospels all end with the resurrection of Jesus. However, in the way that they tell the story, it's clear that the resurrection is not an ending. The resurrection is told as the start of something new, a new Genesis. On the first day of the week, while it was still dark. Easter is the beginning of a new creation. The new creation that's been made possible because Jesus has overcome the forces of corruption and decay. The stories of the Bible tell of the renewal of creation as a recurring event in present history. God will regenerate creation and human community over and over until the time of the ultimate renewal that is yet to come. I want to invite you to consider what it might mean to decide that the story we are in which God is one in which God is taking our dead ends and our confusions and making new beginnings. What does it look like if in our post-COVID and post-COVID world, the church is being summoned to join God in God's work of making a new creation, of reweaving our communities, our neighborhoods that have been broken? I want to begin with the story of God's call to the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived in an age similar to ours, in that it was a time between the ages. One way of life was dying, another way of living was still struggling to be born. And God speaks God's word to this young man. Before I shaped you in the womb, a Genesis story, I knew all about you. Before you saw the light of day, I had holy plans for you, a prophet to the nations. That's what I had in mind for you. Now, as is typical when someone is summoned by God into God's holy work, Jeremiah signals that he feels inadequate to the task. Jeremiah says, Hold it, Master God. Look at me. I don't know a thing. I'm only a boy. We have our excuses too, don't we? We are too old and too tired. There are too few of us. People in our congregation will resist any change. We don't know what to do. We've tried all the church growth techniques that have been suggested to us, and none of them have worked. Did you notice that God doesn't seem to care? Our inadequacy does not disqualify us from being about God's business. Our sense of not being up to the task does not excuse us from doing it. God replies, well, don't say I'm only a boy. I'll tell you where to go and you'll go there. I'll tell you what to say and you'll say it. Do not be afraid of a soul. I'll be right there looking after you. God's decree. Then God reached out and touched Jeremiah's mouth and said, look, I've just put my words in your mouth, hand delivered. See what I've done? I've given you a job to do among nations and governments, a red letter day. Your job is to pull up and tear down, take apart and demolish, and then start over, building and planting. Did you notice that the task given is among nations and governments? The task that God gives in such a time as this is not to get preoccupied with the survival of our churches, even though many of them are in a very precarious state. The work is not to find new strategies to keep our buildings open and our programs running. It's certainly not to find a way to get back to the way things were, to get back to normal as if normal was a good thing, and as if that were at all possible to return to a world that has disappeared. The task God gives us is in the communities in which we exist. The work into which God is inviting us is among the people who are developing new social structures and systems that are shaping our neighborhoods. And Jeremiah is given 6 tasks: to pull up and tear down, to take apart and demolish, and then to start over, building and planting. The pandemic revealed that the pulling up and tearing down, the taking apart and demolishing has been going on for some time now. We became acutely aware of how broken so many of our support systems have been. But even before the pandemic, we were socializing less. We were becoming more disconnected from one another. Our communities were becoming more fragmented. As early as 1986, Leslie Newbegin said, we are witnessing the collapse of modern Western culture, or at least of our confidence in it. We are emerging from the pandemic with communities that are bitterly divided, with social structures that have been pushed to the breaking point and beyond, with people disconnected and isolated and suffering from the trauma of it all. As we emerge from the isolation of the pandemic, there is an opening that before us that has not been present earlier. Because it is now so obvious to so many people that the structures that have shaped our lives have broken down, because it's so obvious that they cannot keep their promises to make our lives safe, secure, or happy, people are now open in a new way to considering alternative scripts. One of the first stops along the pathway to regeneration seems to be to enable people to relinquish the old script, to let go of what is no longer viable, what no longer gives life, what no longer elicits their commitment and their energy. Somebody said the pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different. The rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers a chance to rethink the doomsday machine that we have built for ourselves. We can walk through the portal lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Part of the work of the church in such a time then is to help people navigate through the losses they have experienced. It is to show them that they can give up their old failed scripts and reimagine the world with a different script. They can switch texts, even though we humans do not do that easily. Wonder if we can share in this chat box just a few reflections on which system breakdown has been affecting your community the most. I think different communities have experienced the pandemic in different ways. And if we just take a few minutes to name which system breakdown, which structural breakdown, what script has, which part of the script has been, it's evident that it has been affecting your community, your particular neighborhood, your city or town or village.
So, Brad, affordable housing and good paying jobs for their children and grandchildren. Jenny, divide between individual rights and the common good. In Ottawa, says Laurie, the new LRT is literally off the rails. Monica says the determination to be polite and non-political in public discourse. Pamela says small business supports. Economic overtaking of human needs and connection, says Erin. The issue of rural connectivity, says Lynn. As everything has gone virtual, many of us are being left out. Laurie adds racial inequities in our city, which Monica agrees with. The assumption, says Pamela, that everyone has stable internet. And Connie adds lack of community contact even when we're back together in worship.
It's thinking about Sarnia, which is a small city, southwestern Ontario. And the script that has been most apparent, or the system breakdown, which has been most apparent in our community, I think is surprisingly one of relationships, social relationships, how we treat one another. And it's become apparent to me in a Facebook group that was started at the beginning of the pandemic called Supporting Sarnia Small Businesses, Sarnia and area small businesses. And that the people that started that Facebook group said, we're going to help each other because with the shuttering of our businesses, we're all going to go through a really difficult time. And so we've started this Facebook group, and we're here to support one another. And on a regular basis, the administrators post something that says, we are here to support one another. We are not going to tolerate any negativity about each other and about our businesses. If you have a criticism to make, you talk to that business directly, but we will not tolerate any negativity. We're here to support and help each other. And they keep reiterating that script. And it's interesting to watch how that has certainly shaped how Sarnia businesses and the Sarnia community as a whole has navigated through this pandemic. They are rewriting the script and says, we're not going to be at each other's throats. We're not in competition with each other. We're going to do everything we can to be supportive of one another, to help each other, to walk with each other through this pandemic. And the fight that they constantly have to do to say, that's this other script, we're not living by that script anymore. We're living by this script of being there for each other. Just really interesting. Great. I'm going to keep moving. I'd love to look through some of those a bit more, but anyway, we're going to run out of time, I think. The work of helping people relinquish a failed script is really very critical. The pandemic has done a lot of that work for us, I suspect. However, I've also become convinced, more and more convinced, that we not only need to relinquish that failed script, but we need to move into that part of the story where the church is being called to build and to plant. God is making new pathways to regeneration in our communities, new ways of being in community together. The Holy Spirit is reweaving the fabric of our communities, remaking our society. And in most places, that new way of being in community together looks very messy and very fragile at this point. There's a lot of experimenting going on, and a lot of experiments are not going to work. One thing we do know, though, is that God's regeneration is not going to look like what we are used to. So we're going to have to look carefully and intentionally in order to see it. However, this new way of being in community is taking shape, and our local congregations have a critical role to play in that regeneration of our culture. People are emerging from the pandemic, having endured a long period of isolation. Indeed, I was reminded just last week that some people who have compromised immune systems still are in extreme isolation. And that's very difficult. But for everybody, social connections have been strained and sometimes broken. Somebody has said that almost all of us will come out of the pandemic having varying degrees of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And as with all lingering trauma, none of us will come out of it the same as when we went into it. We're having to think creatively about how to rebuild our life together, how to be in community together. What will our care for each other look like? How will we be accountable for one another? And that need to reshape and restore life-giving relationships, I believe, is the defining context in which the church's mission is taking place. The gift our tradition, our story gives us is that it is full of wisdom about ways in which life-giving communities thrive. We have wisdom in our tradition about how neighbors who are very diverse from one another can live together. We have experience with offering hospitality to those who are strangers and sojourners in our land. We know about living in covenant with God and with other people. We bring insights into the ways to nurture people who live with generosity and faithfulness and grace. We have convictions about what is involved in being fully human and fully alive. And all of these are going to be desperately needed in a post-COVID world. The church is a community that lives by that alternate script. And in living into that alternate script, offers it to the world. As God is rebuilding and planting new ways of being in community together, the local congregation gets to be a community that demonstrates to the world what it means to live in covenant with this living, demanding, loving, and faithful God. It offers to the world a sign of what it means to live in covenant with one another. It demonstrates what it means to live in gracious covenant with our neighbors. The path to regeneration is shaped by the quality of our relationships with God, with each other, and with our neighbors. N.T. Wright puts it this way: though the Holy Spirit can and does work in 1,000 different ways, of which we hear only the rustle in the passing wind, one of the primary ways the Spirit works is through humble, prayerful servants of Jesus, whose hearts have been renewed and whose minds have been enlightened by the powerful gospel, so that they not only believe in Jesus' resurrection and hence in his victory over the dark powers on the cross, but that they become resurrection people, both signs and agents of the new life which will one day flood the whole creation. The early Christian church began as a few small, fragile communities living on the edge of the Roman Empire. At the time, the power of the empire's script seemed strong, but it was waning in the culture as a whole. And in the midst, those small Christian communities were living out of an alternative script. They knew in their own lives the powerful, life-giving force of the God who had raised Jesus from the dead. They were experiencing the creative impulse of the Holy Spirit in their life together. In a variety of ways, they were boldly recreating social structures and systems around them that had broken down. They were figuring out ways to navigate through the challenges and navigate creatively in relationship with their neighbors. Their innovations were able to permeate Roman society as a genuine alternative to the dominant culture. That culture they transformed. So I want to lead us into our question and answer time period with a couple of questions. What if the pathway to joining God's regenerative work, God's new creation, is found in taking our story seriously? What if the pathway to joining God's regenerative work is found by discerning what part of the story we are in and what role we have been given to play, and then playing it hard?
Wow, thank you, Christine. Lots to think about there. And I think Wayne's first comment here, I think, ties into what you had just concluded with. Perhaps Wayne says we're living in a time when God is choosing to be silent, but we can rest in the assurance of the inspired word of Hosea, I hold you in my arms, even though you do not know it is I. Irene asks, Christine, could you just put those last discussion questions into the chat box so that we have them in front of us? That I was wondering that too. That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, those are, I can do that. That was really, I didn't really know that I was expecting people to answer them, or rather, but if people have things they want to say about it, that's great. And otherwise, we'll just throw things open for questions and answers.
Yeah, Aaron has kind of paraphrased that for you. What if the pathway to God's regenerative work is found by taking our story seriously?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And by discerning what part of the story we are in, what role has been given to us to play, and playing it hard.
Yeah. So, questions, thoughts, observations, comments? Not just about the last comment, but about the whole hour. Thank you, Aaron.
I'm wondering too if people are don't have their video cameras off because they're trying to save bandwidth so that they get a better feed. If they can turn their video cameras on, I'd love it if you could, so that I could actually see you and as we're in conversation together. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It takes a few minutes for people to formulate their question and type it, and we never see it until they push enter. So. I was thinking all the way through how important the stories are that we live in, and we're often not always aware of the role we're playing. But that's a really helpful way to help us think about what we're doing. I think this is why stories evolved, right? To help us make meaning out of where we are. Anne is thinking about post-pandemic PTSD and thinking about The Wounded Healer by Henri Nouwen.
Mm. Yeah, this afternoon I'm going to mention about an article by Kevin Rowe about the early Christian churches in the Book of Acts and what it looked like to be playing a role in God's new regeneration or new Genesis. And one of the things he said was that one of the characteristics of those early churches was that they incorporated the suffering into their being and identity, their life, that they didn't, try to bury it or ignore it or resist it. But suffering was just part of who they were, and helping people navigate through suffering was just part of the role they were playing at that point in time.
Bunch of comments coming in here about the importance of story, Christine, and how helpful an image that is. Maggie says, wonderful, thank you. Honor the story, therein lies the gift of wisdom. And Catherine, showing our folks, I guess the folks we minister with, that their stories are not just part of our past, but truly a present time and a telling.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is to live into the stories. We often use this, approach the stories of Scripture looking for a principle that we can apply, or a lesson that we can learn, or some action that we say to people, you should be doing this because this is an example of it. But I think it's a different approach. It's a matter of saying, what part of this, like, how are we living in this story? I heard a story of a man who he says, I don't know how it happened, but he said, every night when I tuck my kids into bed, I began telling them the story of the Hebrew people in Egypt, and the escape from slavery in Egypt. And I don't know how that happened, but it just happened that that's the story we were telling the children every night, and they wanted to hear. And then he said, one day I was overhearing my daughter talk to one of her friends, and she was saying to one of her friends, she says, I don't remember it, but we used to be slaves in Egypt. And one night my dad came, and he picked me up and carried me away, and we escaped, and we're now, found freedom from slavery in Egypt. And he says, that's our approach to the stories is, how do we discern that we are part of that story? That story is still being told in our lives and through our lives. We get to have a part in it.
It had never occurred to me that our standard go-to method of interpretation has been to look for timeless and universal truths in the middle of story. But we do that an awful lot. And what you're saying is something very different, which is to say they encountered God in the journey, and we can too. So there's analogies, but not necessarily universalisms there. A very different way of using story.
Yes, yeah.
Eric mentions appreciation for talking about Jeremiah and how often we're looking for someone else to lead us. Thank you for prompting us to be Jeremiah, to listen to the voice leading, guiding, helping us to stand up and step forward in our own little lives and committees and churches.
One thing I'm struck with when I'm talking with people in congregations is the recurring lament that there are too fewer of us, and we are too tired, and we can't convince people to change, and the laments that we repeat to each other. And I'm just struck by, God doesn't really care. God, and that's not going to stop God from working through you and among you and with you. He can use small, tired, worn out people who think they have no future. He's done that before, and God will do it again.
Yeah, the images that resonate most strongly with me these days are salt and yeast and mustard.
Yeah.
Kenji wonders
Kenji,
about referencing stories that aren't ours. And, to what extent should we be willing to do that? To what extent should we be worried about appropriating stories that aren't ours?
Can you say a bit more about that, Kenji? I think that's a very helpful caution, and that one that a lot of people are wrestling with.
Yeah, and I think that has a muzzling effect, perhaps, that we're too afraid of saying something or taking, like, resonating with another person's story, and we hear everything about, keeping confidence and not telling stories that aren't yours. I think there's value in hearing perspectives and narratives that are not ours, because that's where we find our growing edges. So part of the culture of just fear of being canceled or fear of being called out for being overly appropriative, self-centered, arrogant, culturally, I guess. So there is a fine line. There is a balance that we do need to maintain. But I just wonder if perhaps there is that fear of not saying too much about our own stories because of this culture now, where everyone seems to be quite cautious.
Mm.
I wonder if the way we use stories has something to do with it, Kenji. If we use stories the way Christine is recommending, as illustrative rather than prescriptive, it's a very different way of finding ourselves in the story and finding meaning in story.
And I think, too, we need to be cautious about or reflective about what role we think we are taking in the story, and kind of check ourselves about that. I don't know if this is following on what you're saying, Kenji, but in the story of the Good Samaritan, we often think of ourselves as, oh yes, we're the Good Samaritan in that story, and we're out there helping those who have fallen among thieves. And I think that isn't a helpful a role to take on, even though that's how we've perceived ourselves for decades. I'm wondering what would happen if we said, okay, so what if we aren't the Good Samaritan in the story? What if we are the one who has fallen among thieves? Mm. What difference does that make in how we play out that story?
Jamie raises an interesting point. Maybe Kenji, if you don't want to respond to that, and that's fine, I'll just remove the spotlight. Jamie says, biblical stories, personal stories, do we treat them differently? Because the kinds of stories Kenji was talking about were more personal stories, I think, than or stories from other cultures. You were talking mainly about biblical stories. Do we deal with them differently, or is the same kind of hermeneutical lens brought to both?
Don't know. So anyone else have any wisdom or insight about that?
It's an interesting question, Jamie.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that.
Sure, Eric. Come on, open your mic and tell your story. Why not?
Yeah, I have a very brief story. Years ago, I became quite involved with a fellow who was in AA. And one time, I'd known him for several years, he was lamenting the fact that he felt so close to God but wanted to know more. And so he decided to attend several different churches. And sometime later on, when I met up with him, we had a little men's group. He was in a really bad way. And I said, what's going on? And he said, oh, Eric, God's been so good to me. And I figured I should get to know more about him. So I figured, well, the church has got to be the place where that's going to happen, because, it's Jesus and he's going to lead us and all the rest of it. He said, but And I said, so what happened? And I said, well, I went to some churches and they're not even as good as an AA meeting. And the conversation beyond that then came around to, well, what's the difference between an AA meeting and church?
Mm.
And this is from a fellow who began drinking heavily at age 12. And I was talking to him in his 30s. He'd given up alcohol through AA for only a few years. He had a devastating life. And he said, you go to an AA meeting and everybody calls you by your first name.
Mm.
You go to an AA meeting and people stand up and tell the worst things about themselves straight up, and you hear it straight on. He said, you go to church and you get all this nicey, it's all stories from the past. And like, well, what about right now, right here, me, what's going on? He said, even when you go to coffee time, people go in little cliques and so on. And at any rate, not to go on, but for me, the question of whether we're appropriating other stories, when it comes to the biblical thing, the great gift of the Christian church is that people find resonance between their own personal life story and different stories in Scripture. So when we refer back to stories of the Jewish people, for example, we're doing that because they're interpreting us. Those stories interpret us, and our particular personal experience of fall and recovery or whatever, we find ourselves inspired and moved by it because we see this resonance that's historic, and that then bumps us towards the idea that, oh my goodness, this maybe I'm experiencing something of God right here, right now in my life. So I think there's a great value in paying attention to the kind of stories that people tell in AA, or as we're doing here this morning, but also considering the ways in which the very question you're asking so well, Christine, about where are the stories in which we find ourselves interpreted in Scripture right now at a time of ending and potential new beginning and lots of uncertainty and all the rest of that. I'm so appreciative of this time, Christine, and thank you so much to both you and to Stephen. And I'll get off now. Thanks again.
Kim had asked, can you read that one, Stephen, the Kim Vidal, about who will rewrite the alternative story? It's up.
Yeah, so how are biblical stories becoming relevant? But no, I'm sorry. Who will rewrite the alternative story, says Kim, when most of the writers are worn out, grieving, and stressed? How do we tap the creativity of the community so that stories will be rewritten that are life-giving and hopeful?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the pivots that we need to make in the church, is to think that it's only our strength in our times of strength and energy and having it figured out that we have a story that's worth telling and sharing. I think when most of the story writers are worn out and grieving and stressed, we tell that story. We just lay it out and say, this is what we have to offer to God right now. And it doesn't feel very good to me. It feels inadequate to the task, but we offer the story of our weariness, the story of our stress and how badly we're coping with it. And I think then that becomes the gift. And help other people will find their stories in that and find where God is at work in it. One of the practice I've had for many years is praying the Psalms. Praying the Psalms on a rotating basis every day. So one psalm a day. And so many of those psalms the writers are weary and stressed and grieving. We don't tell them very often in our worship. We don't pray them very often in our worship. The lectionary steers us away from them. But when you are when you pray them, then the psalmist gives you the words that you need for your grief, for your weariness, for your stress, for your experience of being lost, or experience of being under attack. So when you don't have words yourself, then the psalmist gives you those words and teaches you how to navigate through those experiences in the presence of God. So reclaim the Psalms and repray them, and put your own words to them, and offer that as the gift. And I would trust that God can use even that.
I think that's a helpful segue into a couple of the comments on the chat about how we tell or live into the stories of our role with Indigenous people. And a couple of people in the chat acknowledging that that's a history that doesn't feel like it has a lot of good news in it. And many of us were taught that our role is to preach good news. How do we preach that story, the story of our history with the people who lived on this continent before we do? No, I mean, to some extent, we'll get a sort of deep dive into that at 1:30 when Sarah Stratton joins us. But as you think about that part of our story, what's your advice, and does that connect with the lament in the Psalms that you're thinking about?
I think all we can do is tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That the gift that we offer, or the way we navigate through this experience, or this reality of our history, is to be a truth-telling community, trusting that it is the truth that will set us free. It is the truth that will lead us through it to a place of healing. But until the truth is spoken, the gospel can't be heard. And yeah, so you just tell the truth as best as you know how.
Including, as Maggie says, pain, fatigue, confusion, needed truth-telling, needed lament, Good Friday to Holy Saturday.
I think the other thing is that we not only speak the truth as best as we can, but also it's a time in which we need to learn how to listen better. So, I mean, if the truth is we don't know what words to speak into this situation, then maybe we need to just stop talking and start listening.
I have wondered whether we feel faithless when all we can do is lament. If we're ashamed of that, we imagine somehow that we're always supposed to have the answers because we're answer people. I just love it that the tradition doesn't do that. Lament is such a solid part of our tradition.
Well, and again, Walter Brueggemann is so helpful in saying that until the pain gets voiced, it cannot be addressed, it cannot be healed. But the very first step in the process of healing and of giving life is to give voice to the pain.
Jamie says, most people don't want to live into Good Friday. They want to jump straight to Easter.
Yes.
I think most of us do Good Friday because we know that Easter is coming. But in the first Good Friday, they didn't. Maybe we need to acknowledge that.
And we try to avoid Good Friday, but the reality is that we keep getting placed in Good Friday. So, we can pretend that that's not happening, or we can give people language and ritual and practices whereby they can admit to the truth of Good Friday in their lives.
Isn't it interesting how you started by talking about all sorts of different stories and we've ended up talking about lament? That really does capture a sense of where the church is at these days. But in our last 3 minutes together on this lecture, Christine, I'm wondering, are there other stories we need to be telling besides lament? Let me turn that to everybody in the chat, not just to you. The lament is a part of the tradition maybe we've neglected, but is that the only thing we should be focusing on, or are there other things that we should be focusing on now too?
Well, I definitely think that we need to be telling Genesis stories, because what is so apparent to us is the need for lament, is the need to process the loss. But what is actually going on is underneath, in addition to the loss, God is generating something new. There's just the beginnings, the seeds of something new being created in our communities. And we need to be in on that. That it isn't just lamenting, it is building and planting, even as we lament, singing the Lord's song in the new land, even as we, hang up our harps and weep.
I don't think we can wrap it up any better than that, Christine. I think we should just sort of acknowledge that really is going to lead us into your next lecture at 3:30. News from the margin.
Yes, and talk about, I'm going to share with you some stories of congregations that are already in that the new creation, living into that new creation, and what kinds of things that they're doing. And this, I don't know that they would frame it that way, but I see them as living in that new creation that God is making. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah, sounds exciting. And Aaron closes us with these words from John 12:24. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Aaron. And thank
you
all. I really appreciate the comments you made. I hope you'll save those, Steve, so we can look through them again.
Sure. Happy to do that. And friends, thank you. Thank you for an interesting and engaging and varied conversation. What a wonderful way to start our day today. So we've got a half-hour break now, and I'd invite you to go and walk around the block and get some fresh air and stretch, because we've got another long sit on Zoom when we resume again in half an hour. And a very different kind of conversation coming up. We've got Greg Braun coming. Greg is going to talk about championing God's blessings. We'll focus on how ministers and lay people can effectively communicate God's blessings both inside and outside the congregation, resulting in many types of growth. So an important change of gears and a valuable counterpart to some of the things that Christine's been talking about this morning, and we'll pick up again at 3:30. We'll see you in half an hour. All the best. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Stephen.